Over to you, Chair.
And good morning and welcome to the Kirklees Council's Corporate Scrutiny Panel. We've got an interesting agenda lined up this morning with the technology strategy. And technology has been a saviour to us during the coronavirus crisis, so it'll be really interesting to hear about that and see where we go with it. Would members of the committee like to introduce themselves first before we kick off?
I'm Philip Challoner, I'm the Public Co-optee.
Councillor Will Simpson, Denverdale Ward Councillor and member of the panel.
I'm Councillor John Taylor, Kirklees Ward and member of the panel.
Councillor Mahmood Dr. Bartley Ward.
Councillor Graham Turner, Corporate Cabinet Member.
Okay, thank you everybody. Is that everybody? Right, good. So over to minutes of the previous meeting. Does anybody wish to bring anything up under the minutes of the previous meeting? Okay, we'll approve those. Right, over to interests. Does anybody have any interests to declare? No. Okay. Are there any deputations or petitions? Nope. Questions by members of the public? Written questions?
None received.
None received. And we've received apologies from councillors Lawson, Homewood, so far for this meeting. Okay, so we'll now hand over to Terence Hudson, Head of Technology, to give us a presentation on the technology strategy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'll let Andy Simcox speak first. Morning, Andy.
Hey, good morning, all. Hello. Thanks, Terence, and thank you, Chair. Just for a very brief introduction, because yes, Terence is the person who knows the most about what we're about to talk about. Just to introduce myself, I'm Service Director for Strategy and Innovation, which includes the IT service and a few others. And just very briefly, what I want to say in context is the technology strategy is one of our key enabling strategies as an organisation. If you think about people and access and assets as well as the IT, and we brought the technology strategy through informal scrutiny last year, and then the world changed and it came into operation. So it's really been tested out, and Terence will describe that. My view is that any strategy should have a degree of longevity. If you need to change it every 6 months or every year, it's not a good strategy. So what we did was aimed for enduring themes within that and then into action. And the pandemic's clearly tested that. But where we're at now, is that we're obviously living with COVID and thinking about beyond that and implementation through 1, 2, 3 year action plans that will need to be added to it. They are currently in development and will embed the strategy further. And that will also look at the purpose and shape of our internal IT service and how we connect with partners in delivery as well. So what sort of skills do we need? What technical infrastructure do we need? What I would say is I think technology's held up pretty well on the whole in the last year. The people have been brilliant within the organisation, and I think that all councillors have benefited from that to a large extent, particularly in getting these sorts of things up and running. But obviously there are challenges, and we mustn't fool ourselves that means that everything will be plain sailing from here. You know, we do have and will continue to have ongoing development and investment needs, as is the case with any type of infrastructure, and obviously we'll be subject to external factors like public networks or broadband infrastructure. So stuff does happen from time to time, and again, I'm sure you'll have all experienced that. Terence will be able to tell you what that's meant in the last year, and I will hand over to him.
Thank you very much, Andy. I'm just going to open up the PowerPoint presentation, and hopefully you will all see that very shortly. Yes, that's up on screen, thanks. So I'll do a quick introduction for myself. My name's Terence Hudson and I'm Head of Technology here at the Council. It's interesting because it doesn't feel like just over 12 months ago that I was in informal scrutiny talking about this and setting us out on our journey for the next 5 years. So for today, what we're really going to reflect on is probably why it doesn't feel like it's just over 12 months ago, because of everything that's happened during the COVID pandemic. So I'll just do a quick recap of what our strategy said. So we've got 2 slides here. The first one is we just want to set out, we have a clear vision in our minds, which is about being innovative, being effective, and making sure technology is sustainable. There's no point just putting technology in for today and forgetting about it tomorrow. And really, this is about how we design what we do around people, places, partners, businesses, because we have a big influence over a lot of that. It isn't a case of the IT department is just the introvert IT department of the past that just worries about transactional services in the council. We have a lot of influence to bring to bear over what goes on outside as well. So underneath here, we've got 4 of our ambitions, and they're quite simply labelled around getting the basics right, making sure our infrastructure works and is resilient and robust, making sure the applications that we use are fit for the future and for the long term, and that we start using data intelligently and securely. So within that, you have cyber security as well as information governance type activities. And on the next slide, it's the last 3 ambitions that we have. So we talked about developing inclusive technology and skills. You'll note with that title, we didn't use the term digital inclusion, because actually it's about, we split it into 2 halves in my mind. It's the skills and tech, but then it's about connecting people, connecting businesses, and connecting technology into that jigsaw. So there's 2 big statements there around what we're doing. And then the last one is around what we're doing in the public domain around delivering class-leading internet services on our website, for example. So what have we done in the last 12 months? So in terms of getting the basics right, the first thing we did was we spotted a global pandemic was on the horizon. So we made sure that we were ready for that, and we invested in equipment for staff. And then the next thing we did was really ramp up what we've got here now, which is getting people connected every single day. And every single day, 3,500 people who work for Kirklees are in a number of Teams meetings every single day. Which looked at our service desk offer, because obviously we couldn't do face-to-face services in the way we'd done before. So we needed to really shift the way our operations work in our service desk. And again, that has proved relatively successful, but obviously there's lots of work to do in all of these areas. And then the next one was around once we started moving out of the first lockdown, was making sure our workplaces were COVID ready and safe places to work. So we worked hand in hand with our corporate landlord colleagues to make sure that happened. And the last bit around getting the basics right, and it's probably, you could think it's a simple one, but it actually has a big impact. This is around working with Wakefield City Council and providing a local telephone number for their test and trace service, because what we didn't want was to be having unknown telephone numbers, mobile phone numbers, because it doesn't engender trust in the public. So it's really important that we work with Wakefield to help them, and we provide them that service. The next slide, and I'm assuming that has moved on, is labelled enabling resilient and available infrastructure. Again, I'll wind back to March of last year, which was, we knew the challenge was looming. So we took the decision to make some significant changes on our network to ensure that 4,500 people could work at home. And within 2 weeks of that first lockdown, we'd pretty much achieved that, and we'd done some quite innovative stuff that we'd not done before. And it's all credit to the people who worked on that. And then during that space in time over the next 11 months, we basically took some opportunities to start making some more changes to ready ourselves for what the future is going to look like. So we've done some resilience work between Huddersfield and Dewsbury. So we're looking at how we can situate some of our services in both of those towns instead of everything being revolving around just Huddersfield. And that was underpinned by, we worked with Network Rail. So the idea of working with Network Rail is we came about a couple of years ago, but we really made it happen over the last 12 to 18 months, where we've now physically connected Dewsbury and Huddersfield's private networks. So it is a big deal for both those towns in my mind, but it also sets us up for what could we do differently in the future. And we really are proving the concept around why you might use some of those infrastructure options, not only just for the council, but for other organisations in either of those two places. And the last point is around, again, it was just a tactical thing. The CCG CIO got in touch with me and said, can you help us? We need to put a network into the stadium. And again, it was just a case of, right, work together, let's spin it up and let's make sure it works. And again, which is something we just sorted in a couple of weeks, but it's the effort and energy that goes into it is what's really important. And on to the next slide. This one is the connecting people, businesses and technology slide. So I think that the big story here, is the work we've done alongside the DFA, but also the fact that we've provided 1,300 laptops ourselves from the council. So in total, we've provided 5,895 laptops to schools in Kirklees, maintained schools in Kirklees. That's a big deal, and but it's all started to be highlighted during this kind of coming out of the first lockdown into the second lockdown, where this really came to the fore, and it really became a big deal to start talking about. The next one is, and this is probably where those kinds of stories came out of. So we've deployed technology to a number of VCS groups. We've actually started talking to those VCS groups like we've never done in the past. And again, it is a big deal. So as a for example, we've been working with local services to you in Ashbrow around some of these challenges that they face. And the next line is, another one we've probably never done before. We're providing devices firstly into our own care homes for residents. At any one point in time, there are 14,000 residents in care homes who receive care from us in some way, shape, or form. And the old model of providing IT in those locations was just for the staff. But actually, we need to be mindful of those residents, because what really became apparent in lockdown 1 was how isolated people became in some of those places. And the next one is around just in general supporting the fibre network builds across Kirklees. So we know, once the rules was clarified at lockdown 1, a lot of fibre providers started making tactical investments. So we know we were helping City Fibre overcome some of the hurdles that might not have been as easy to overcome with the technology that was at hand and the opportunity that was at hand with road closures and so on. But also around that same kind of period of time, within the last quarter of last year, Openreach announced that they're going to light up two areas in Kirklees, and they were Kirkburton and Flockton. And again, that's partly down to their own plans and their capital investment, but I think partly that's down to some of the influence that we bring to bear. I'm going to move on to the next slide if I can. So that's the first time I've used this. So here we go. So the next one is around skills, and the first thing and the most important thing, obviously, is the work we did with councillors, getting 69 councillors online, using Teams comfortably, attending council meetings and so on virtually. Yeah, it was a big achievement. I think it was really important, and I'm really proud of the work that we did in that space. Going back to the previous slide and linking to the VCS groups, we have formed a cross-sector digital inclusion partnership, and again, the conversations have evolved and move on in those discussions. It really has become apparent I don't like to just talk about digital inclusion as being my starting point. For me, it's about social inclusion as a starting point for a lot of the work that we've done there, and inclusion into everyday life. So the story around the kit for kids in school it's about enabling them to do what they couldn't have done previously. We've partnered with Kirklees College to deliver Office 365 training, and the last one, I'm quite proud of this one actually, is that the amount of equipment, going back to the previous slide again, around the number of people who are in care at any one time in Kirklees, is we've actually been working with the NHS quite a lot around putting devices into private sector care homes for the first time, to make sure that residents in those care homes are equally able to connect to their families as somebody in a Kirklees Council care home. And the last slide is around class leading internet services. So I've linked to the previous slide. We've had well over 90 virtual council meetings now have been held. Yes, every now and then we have a bit of a wobble, and yesterday we had a bit of a wobble with planning because of the issues that we had with Teams. But you know, most of the time it does work well, and we're getting really good engagement in those meetings. In terms of what we've done around the COVID, we've regularly updated our web content, and the number of page hits to COVID-related web content is now at 1.5 million hits. So it just goes to show that that is trusted content. And at the same time, we've also processed 12,000 business grant requests through our website, and we've processed over 20,000 requests for support to people and communities during that period of time. So it's great to know that people do know that they can go to Kirklees Gov.uk and get the services that they want. And the last one is we have produced and hosted a number of public health events, and we also did an event for Remember Us Sunday. You'll notice that I've only touched on 5 of the ambitions there because I really wanted to focus on those 5 areas. Obviously, we have done lots of other work in those areas as well. But for me, these are the 5 key stories in terms of our response around COVID. So what have we learned and what's the next steps? I think the first learning point is that the strategy itself provided us with the framework to really articulate what our response should be. Without it, I think we might have done the work, but we might have done it in a completely different way. So I think the strategy really does stand up as being valid. And you know, as Andy mentioned at the start, I think what's really important is now how we turn those plans into those strategic visions and deliver some real change over the next 4 years. Second learning point is, I'll be really honest at this point. I just cannot believe the value that we've got out of working with partners and voluntary and community sectors. I know when I came into Scrutiny this time last year, that was one of the strong messages that was given, but the benefit of that is just absolutely astronomical, and it really has set us on a new place where we really are thinking about how technology genuinely makes a difference to people's lives, not just around delivering service within the council. So that next point really is about, so technology is enabler. It's when we really need to keep saying that it is about enabling a difference. It isn't the thing that you start with to say, here you go, here's a solution. It is an enabler for lots of different things. And the last thing is around, the next step, which is a lot of what we've done is tactical responses to the challenges that we've had. So now it's about moving into that strategic planning space and really bringing a much more value from that partnership working. So that's me done. And I'll say thank you for listening to any questions.
Okay, thanks for that, Terence. Very interesting, and as I said at the beginning, it's been technology has been our saviour during the pandemic crisis, and you do look at this and think what life would have been like 10 years ago, or even less, even without the technology support that we have. I'm now going to open it up to members. If any members wish to ask Terence or Andy a question at this point?
Yeah, all right.
Could you stop sharing screen, Terence? All right, yeah. Thank you. Okay, who's first? Stunned into silence.
I was just sorry. I put my hand up.
Oh right. Okay. Yeah, you did. Off you go.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay. I'm quite impressed with what you've done over the last few months. It's really quite amazing. I mean, I work on the periphery of the technology side, working with informatics and stuff. But I'm just saying, well done, basically.
Thank you.
Councillor Taylor, John Taylor. John, we could easy done.
Earlier on, my dogs were barking, that's why I went on mute. But for me, yes, I'm very, very complimentary, Terence, and particularly with the support that you've been over the longer term providing to me as a ward councillor in trying to get fibre technology out and beyond the urban areas into the more rural areas, because I think that's one of the things that we have learned, and we've seen this with some of the meetings we've been on with some councillors who still have difficulty with broadband, where we have meetings where you'll have people who sound like Daleks or they're dropping in or out. So we still do have parts of the borough where the technology, when it works like this, is absolutely fantastic. If you're in an area where you have poorer broadband, yeah, it's still a real problem. So we, in a sense, while I'm hugely complimentary, we can't really rest on our laurels, can we, Terence? We need to still be pushing on and pushing as a council, also pushing the government and pushing the technology companies to make sure that decent speed of broadband and that consistency of service is available to all, not just those. I mean, I'm a fortunate person in that my house is quite near to one of the BT cabinets, so I get a really good broadband speed as a result of that. But in my community, as you get further away from the cabinets, the worse the service can be. So I just, that would be the point I would make, that this is great, and I'm not sure we'll ever go back to where everybody always meets all of the time, and technology will continue to play a larger part in our lives. And I think my other observation would be, and I think you kind of skirted over it, that teaching us 69 councillors how to do this stuff has probably been for some more of a challenge than others. So I appreciate you and the team's support and resilience in getting us there, to be honest. So I think I'll leave it at that. But thank you.
We know who they are, John. We know who they are. Okay.
Can I just respond to John's point around? I mean, obviously, thanks for the comments around the councillors. Yes, that was a challenge, but it was a challenge that was worth taking on, because obviously you are important. In terms of the infrastructure build, I think this is where our role really comes to bear, because previously I used to talk about a place called Denby Dale, and the fact that the fact that there are 3 council buildings in Denby Dale. Sorry, not Denby Dale. Sorry, Shepley. It's a place like Shepley where we've got 3 council buildings in Shepley, and they're all connected to full fibre. And how does that influence the fibre companies? And it was great to see that Openreach actually did light up the exchange in Kirkburton. So everybody in Kirkburton, everybody in Denby Dale, and all the way up to the Sovereign pub can now get full fibre. It's just a case of the ISPs need to know that and sell that to you. So again, there's work to be done there. There is, and the next piece of big work from the DCMS is around outside in, and then bringing investment into, this is where I've got my places mixed up, into Denby Dale and that area, because of its connection into Penistone, as a for example. So that is a big piece of work. We've got DEFRA funding inside Kirklees as well. So for super rural areas, they're going to get 5G type technology, where you will actually be able to connect to the internet over the air rather than using wires. But ultimately, our mission is to make sure that we work with all of those providers to get fibre into nearly every single household in Kirklees. And then it's the super rural is the bit that gets filled in by a company called Quickline.
Thank you. We've got a question coming from Elizabeth Smage saying, what are the plans for next year?
What are the plans for next year? Well, it's probably the plans are being formed in terms of the ambitions in the strategy, but I would probably say that the big key areas are around moving into a place where we can support what Councillor Taylor refers to as that kind of hybrid space, where you'll have lots of people working at home, but also more people working in the offices. So there is a big push there around making sure that our services can support that new way of working, because that really changes what we do and how we deliver things. Because it was easy when it was all inside. It was relatively easy when it was largely all outside, but into that hybrid space is going to be a big challenge. So that's one area. Another area is really making improvements around the getting the basics right story. So when we start changing the way we work, how we then respond to that and improve the services that we offer to everybody who connects into our network. And then the big other area for me is around continuing the work on the inclusion piece, around making sure we support all of those initiatives, whether it's putting devices into people's hands, getting people skilled up to support people in our communities and so on. So for me, it's the inclusion piece is another big story. So at the moment, they're probably the three kind of key strands of work that we're going to certainly take forward into the next 6 months. And then around that, there are other pieces where there's a big investment in cyber technology, and it's the kind of stuff that I can't talk about in the public domain, but I'm more than happy to talk about privately.
Okay, Andy Simcox, did you want to come back on that at all?
Yeah, please, if I could just add to what Terence has given you there, because they are clearly specific and important things over the course of the next year. I mean, for me, I would say there's kind of 3 steps or 3 phases that we're currently working on. So there is obviously continuing to support and develop during the pandemic. We quite clearly have got a number of months to get through for that, and that will continue to take up quite a lot of time and resource for existing staff and existing commitments. And we can see the end in sight to some extent, can't we? So we don't want to relent on that and ensure that happens. Quite clearly, what we're also having conversations about is recovery. So how do we go beyond that, and what does that look like in terms of adjusted services, and where does technology support that? And that's a conversation that is about more than technology, isn't it? It's where is technology an enabler for council services, plus where do we get the best out of our people? And as I said at the start, what does that mean in terms of accommodation? And that could adjust some of our technical priorities as well, if we're talking about more delivery within place, different places. As Terence majored quite a lot on Huddersfield and Dewsbury in the developments. What does this mean in supporting place-based working as we move further into recovery? And then the third bit is quite clearly, as I said at the start, this technology strategy is something that's designed to endure. So planning for 2-3 years further down the line is also a part of the conversations that we're having now. So we should have staged plans, I guess, in answer to Councillor Major's question. It's about pandemic, building into recovery, but then also the longer term.
Okay, John Taylor's asked to come back to that. If you can do that briefly, because there are others wanting to speak.
Yeah, and it's just looking at those rural areas, and I just want to share an example. It's actually in the Denby Dale ward, where we have a new housing development. Because of the size of the housing development, Openreach are providing fibre to the door on that new development, but are unwilling to make it available to the neighbouring properties. So I think there's something usefully that we can do from a technology strategy in terms of talking to planning to try and get a bit more joined up in that. So I wonder if Terence and Andy would take that away, because it seems ludicrous that in some of our more rural areas where you may have 2 or 3 or 4 houses, they're suddenly having 10, 15 houses built next to them that are going to be enabled with full technology, but they won't have it. And they're told by Openreach that they need to, sort of put up the funding if they want the full fibre broadband out to their houses as well. So I think there is a role for us as a council through planning to try and influence some of that, to make those, if they are providing cabling to new developments, that they make it in an open way so that it can be accessed by others as well. And I just think that's probably a discussion for you guys perhaps to take away and talk to planning about how we could make that more effective. So I hope that's a helpful contribution.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, but that's actually is on the table, and we've been talking to the new director in that space and a number of his teams. So I've got the major projects team in particular are looking at those kinds of aspects as well. But I'm just mindful that there will be a massive lot for grabs within that area, so that will get funded by the DCMS quite soon.
Okay. Councillor Will Simpson.
Thanks, Chair. In response to Liz's question, my plans for next year is get out of the house, maybe go to a pub, hopefully. Yes, I indicated to speak when John was first speaking. I was going to just echo sort of what he was saying about the digital connectivity stuff, and Terence then came in and answered a lot of that, which is really, really helpful. I know that Graham's been speaking to him about some of our Denby Dale stuff, so yeah, I won't need to go over that again, but yeah, it's a priority for us, and I know it's a priority for you, so thank you very much. And secondly, I just wanted to say, sort of as Philip did, a thank you in terms of what's been done over the last 12 months, particularly for care homes, because that was something Graham and I got in touch about early on in the pandemic when visits were stopped. And, you know, I think councils have got we've got a bit of a reputation in the past, I think, just generically in terms of being a bit of, you know, too bureaucratic and rigid and inflexible. And in the pandemic as a council, I think we've been fantastic. And what you have done, particularly through that stuff in providing those devices, you know, which isn't a statutory service or anything, we've gone above and beyond in terms of ensuring that that's there. So I just wanted to say thank you very much for that in particular, and everything that you've done, but that in particular.
Thank you. Thanks for the request.
Can we just... Sorry.
Okay, Philip Challen has still got your hand raised.
I've got my hand raised. It's a new hand raised. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
You go for it.
Okay. So thank you for that. The strategy of trying to make sure you get sort of fibre or good broadband into every household in Kirklees is a very good vision, a fantastic vision. What concerns me is that, you know, as well as you've got your urban your rural issues, in the urban areas you've got quite a lot of deprivation, and though you might be able to get the fibre to their door, they're not going to be able to afford to run a subscription on that. And I think this became more apparent during lockdown, because a lot of families with children and things in deprived areas would, you know, they could give it a laptop or whatever, but they will also have difficulty connecting up to that. And I don't know whether, or what can be done to enable that, to make sure that every citizen has some opportunity to interact.
That's a very interesting question, and I think that's something that was borne out in the last lockdown around. So, what's the role of central government as well, and working with, in that case, it was the mobile phone providers, because, you know, by I think it's about the second week of January, something was done that meant the mobile phone providers would give free data to every household that needed it to make sure their kids stayed online. So there's work to be done there, that's for certain, and there's certainly work to be done locally around some of those initiatives where we might be bringing some influence, we might be doing something different. So there's conversations underway with people in the housing department, as a for example, around some of those issues. So yeah, it's work in progress, but I think it's a national issue as well as a local issue, and it needs to be addressed two ways.
Thank you.
And Andy Simcox, you want to come back on that as well?
Yeah, just very briefly to add, I guess Terence is right. You know, it's where we can influence, if there are connections to be made with suppliers as well as at a national level, that's important. I guess where that does come into, or if it does come into local decisions, then that's clearly something that we will bring forward for discussion for councillors to decide. You know, where do you want to put your priorities in relation to these sorts of things? But you know, that's definitely something we can bring forward.
Okay, so any more for any more? Let's have a look. Yeah, my thought really is that you know, the success of digital technology during the crisis and how well meetings have actually gone sort of brings into question the need for all our office space. And I can imagine that some of the buildings that we have will become superfluous, or at least maybe it's a good idea that they actually become superfluous. And so it's going to be interesting to see what happens with that, and it could actually be part of the reshaping of our town centre. We've got a police station which is going to be disappearing in the civic quarter. We've got maybe another building around the civic quarter might go, who knows. So what's happened here has probably accelerated the reshaping of our town centres, and will probably fit into the Huddersfield blueprint. So that's quite interesting to me. Okay, anything more on this topic before we move on? No, thanks very much, Andy and Terence. Really interesting, and thanks for all your work during the crisis.
Very much.
Crisis.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Terence.
Okay, we now move on to the council's financial management update. Is Eamon Croston here?
One sec. Yes, I am.
Right, over to you, Amy.
Thank you. Can you see me all right?
No.
Right.
I can.
We can see, yeah, we can see you here, but we can't see your face. But that's okay.
Oh, okay.
Whatever.
That might be an advantage. I don't know. Okay, for people who don't know me, my name's Eamon Cross and I'm Service Director Finance for the council. So what's included this morning is an update on all matters related to council financial management. It's a fairly high level update, but it tries to bring together various strands in a quite a, shall we say, dynamic and fast moving environment. So I've chunked the high level update into three broad areas, or number of broad areas. So the first bit is just where we're at in terms of progress on our in-year financial position. So certainly on the general fund revenue, if you recall at Q1, we were predicting around about 7.7 million overspend, particularly in the early days of COVID and the financial pressures that was having on the bottom line. That had reduced to 5.5 million forecast overspend by Q2, and as at Q3, which is a separate report on the Cabinet agenda for 16th of March, we'll be projecting under 2 million, so 1.9 million. So I think certainly for last quarter and this time, from an officer perspective, we've been reasonably confident that trajectory could go in the right direction, and that still making strides so that by year end we would broadly be delivering a balanced budget. You'll see that one of the appendices attached to the report also sets out all the many and varied COVID funding allocations that we're also managing in year as well, and I think I've counted up to 29 that were listed. So that just gives you an indication of the scale of the various types of financial support that have been afforded to the council and continue to be afforded to the council current year, that we're working with partners and with various government departments to match the additional spend or income loss with the various funding allocations on offer. So that's quite an extensive and continuing piece of work. So that will also play out in terms of year-end position, and clearly from our perspective, we want to ensure that we maximise the funding allocations so that we don't miss out on any additional spending that isn't matched to the right funding. So we're pretty confident we'll get there as well. In terms of collection fund position, that's still reflecting a deficit in Q3, possibly slightly less than Q2, but that's still quite volatile, and some of that is probably related as well to what's happening nationally around some of the extended reliefs, etc., which I'll come on to in terms of a verbal update around the March 3rd budget statement. So that will roll forward into 21-22, whatever the deficit positions could be on our collection fund at year end, which factors in council tax income and business rates income. There's also in the report touch on the SIP for Financial Resilience Index update, which has been refreshed using local government outturn information for 1920. If you recall, a couple of years back, SIP for the accounting body for public sector were increasingly concerned, as we all were, about the financial sustainability of councils. So to help I suppose challenge, support and review where our relative standing was in sustainability, they introduced a number of indices, and it's kind of backward looking because it's based on broadly on outturn information and looks at trend analysis, but in and amongst a whole raft of other indicators, it was seen as potentially a suite of indices that could kind of guide in terms of our relative benchmark performance in a number of areas. So that's in the public domain. And the latest position, I've shown a summary of it, I think, on as one of the appendices, and the one we tend to home into is our general fund reserves position as a proportion of our net revenue budget stream, and where do we sit, particularly across our Metropolitan Authority colleagues. And I think since this index has been released, we've been kind of in the middle of the pack in terms of relative performance, in terms of percentage, and that's borne out in terms of the 1920 update as well. I think the other thing to appreciate, because it is based on historic information, there's been quite a lot happening in the last 12 months as well. So I suspect that some of those indicators will have changed dynamically through the year in light of what's happened with COVID, but they will, again be updated at 2021 year end, but we won't get the information for a while. So it's a guide. It's not definitive, but it gives you an indication or something to actually probe and review. And I know we had a presentation at Corporate Scrutiny panel a while back in terms of just sort of looking through the various indices. National intelligence updates didn't have a chance to incorporate any of the budget announcements because the papers were being published the same day. So I'll come on to that in a minute in terms of what the local impact of some of those announcements are. We obviously know that the government introduced the roadmap for recovery on 22nd of February. So that clearly has implications for all of us in all aspects of our lives, and from a council and partner perspective in terms of planning for reopening and phasing of that and how that's going to impact. So that's obviously something as part of our local recovery that we're already starting to look at. And as we know, schools, colleges, education sector effectively reopened on 8th of March, and the next key milestone I think is 12th of April, subject to the government's 4 tests, which might be relief to some of us. So it means we can have our hair cut and our nails done, in and amongst other things. So and then there's I think further deadlines down the line as well. You might have picked up from national press as well that there was, as part, even pre-COVID, there were a number of conversations already happening at a national level with government and councils around financial sustainability. And as you know, 1 or 2 councils, their Section 151 officers have issued what's referred to as Section 114 notices, which is when councils are in such a, I suppose, perilous financial state that there's a statutory directive that can be enacted by the Section 151 officer to effectively freeze spending for other than just very essential services, and have a period of time for council officers and members to reflect and come up with proposals. And what government said at a point in time is, look, we need to review this a little bit because of the unprecedented circumstances we're currently in, and then COVID kicked in as well. That actually come and have a talk with us, MHCLG, Ministry of Housing, Communities, Local Government, and have that informal chat. Do what you need to do within your respective councils in terms of highlighting some of the issues, but we'll have a chat with you, and if it requires it on an exceptions basis, we could potentially, with 1 or 2 of you, if you want to go forward that and your plans stack up in terms of future recovery, to issue what was referred to as a capitalisation directive, which is basically borrowing to cover your revenue budget gaps over the short term as an emergency measure, rather than issue a Section 114 notice. And a number of councils have already come forward. I think when I wrote this, 4 councils had come forward, and that's been published on the government website. And I think there's a link to it in the report. There's a couple more that have come forward since then. I think Wirral Council have asked for and been granted a 9 million capitalisation directive to support some of the short-term budget gaps they've got, and Croydon Council 120 million capitalisation directive over 2 years. But as we know, they're a council that recently issued a Section 114 notice. So it does vary quite a bit. I think the 121 million one is by far the biggest, and it's over a 2-year period. And MHCLG have stated that they won't extend that beyond the 2 years for that particular council. But they're very much the exceptions at the moment. But I think it's just a reflection of the times we're in, that we are starting to see an increasing number of councils, albeit drip feeding at the moment, that are having those conversations. And undoubtedly there have been more councils than that have also had those conversations, but for various reasons have taken the view not to go forward with that capitalisation directive. So that's just to be aware and understand the national financial landscape that's impacting on local government. And I think for those councils, effectively, some of the what's played out with COVID has probably pushed them a little bit nearer to the edge or over the edge. Possibly in relation to some of the pre-existing issues that they had pre-COVID, and it's just kind of accelerated some of those issues. I'll come on briefly to budget statement. So just in terms of key highlights, because I'm sure you've had all had a chance to sort of reflect individually and through what's been played out in terms of national commentaries on that and various briefings, etc. But I suppose the more pertinent ones for us is that the extended business rates release that were introduced at the start of COVID have been extended into 2021-22 for eligible retail, hospitality and leisure properties in England. So that means 100% relief up to the end of June, and then 66% relief to the end of March 2021. And I think some of the reasoning for that and some of the other measures is to sort of tie in and sync with the roadmap recovery as well, without prejudice, because that's still subject to tests, and with a fair wind we won't see a resurgence of some of the COVID infection rates, particularly the vaccination programme being rolled out, or if there is, it might be more localised and different measures to approach it, rather than what's happened over the last 12 months where we've had a succession of lockdowns or introduction of tier restrictions. So councils will receive 100% compensation for those additional release through Section 31 grants, as we will. As well. So at face value, it won't cost us for the government extended those release, and there'll be some new burdens money as well for any additional admin IT costs associated with what we need to do to make the systems ready and compliant to deliver what government wants us to deliver. As you fully appreciate as well, we've been administering a number of business support grants in year. Again, I think the report touched on that. I think the report said we distributed just under £130 million worth of COVID-related business support grants in year. The latest figures are that's now just under 140 million in year, and we've currently got, I think, 10 schemes that are live that will run till the 31st of March in the current year. And as you well know, the two big original schemes in themselves allocated, I think, just over 100 million to around about 9,500 businesses in the borough. So it's a significant amount of business support that we've administered locally on behalf of central government, as does every other council in the country. And I think government have estimated that overall that accounts for about £25 billion worth of business support nationally in the current year. One of those business grant schemes can roll forward into next year. It's the additional restrictions grant. So that doesn't shut down on the 31st of March. That will roll forward into next year. And government have also announced a £5 billion one-off pot called Restart Grant, which again is aimed at retail, hospitality, accommodation, leisure, personal care, gyms. So that's to support businesses as part of the broader economy reopening drive. So that will comprise a number of one-off grants depending on the nature and size of the business relative to its business rates. So it could be anywhere between, if you're non-essential retail, for example, you could get up to £6,000 per premise to reopen and start trading safely, and then other categories that are expected to open later as part of the roadmap to recovery could get up to £18,000 per premises. So government guidance, detailed guidance on that is expected around about 22nd of March. So, clearly in the background, officers will be working closely with the relevant government departments, and I think, with other councils in the region to make sure that collectively we're ready we're ready to roll on that, but it might require some systems work around some aspects of that. But we're hoping to get those grants out quite obviously as early as we can, but in line with the roadmap recovery as well. So some might be at a later date rather than an earlier date, subject to detailed guidance. We know that furloughing's been extended as well to the end of September. And I think firms are being asked, certainly through July and August, to start contributing 10% and then 20%. So that's impacting around about 11 million workers to date. So we don't know what's going to happen when furloughing ends, to what extent some of the businesses that currently have furloughed staff will still be in existence, or what impacts that going to have in terms of the overall economy and sustainability of those businesses. But clearly there's been significant funding put into supporting businesses and supporting individuals through the whole past 12 months and the next 6 months. And that also includes as well the self-employed income support scheme as well, I think that's what it's called. So that's been extended to July 2021. So up to 600,000 people would benefit or could benefit from that. We also know that the extra £20 per week on universal credit has currently been extended to the end of September 2021 as well, and other measures like stamp duty holiday extensions as well. So it kind of all sort of ties into the current government predictions about the phasing of the restart and kickstarting the economy in line with the roadmap. Undoubtedly, as has happened all the way through, some of those might be up for review and further consideration as we go through. So there were some other key announcements as well, more around sort of broader national infrastructure regeneration funding. There's a UK Community Renewal Fund, 220 million national funding allocation, where government has identified 100 priority places. And I think regionally that would be administered through West Yorkshire Combined Authority, depending which priority projects they want to take forward and how the bidding process goes into central government. There's a community ownership fund which was announced for 150 million. Again, national funding allocation, so that various communities and facilities, local facilities, could benefit again from the restart. Again, the detail behind that to follow, and announcements around UK Infrastructure Bank potentially deploying up to £12 billion worth of equity and debt capital, including a 10 billion underwrite. So that's quite potentially significant development, and that's to support both private sector and local authority infrastructure projects UK wide, and that's particularly to help government objectives around climate change and regional economic growth. So I'll probably stop at that point. The only other point reflection on the budget announcement was clearly that it was geared substantively towards the next 6 months, the next 12 months in terms of recovery effort, with obviously some funding allocations that would extend beyond that. And in that spirit, there were no specific announcements about the longer term trajectory or trends or forecasts around what it means for public services, for example, going forward, or public finance or local government financing, all that. So that's very much, I think, the absolute critical phase, I think, in terms of local government financial sustainability beyond 21-22 is going to be a combination of factors, some around how the economic recovery or the scale of that, or what's happening globally, nationally or locally around recovery from the pandemic is going to then impact locally in terms of reinvigorating local economies, in terms of council tax, in terms of business rates and other income support, and also in terms of pressure on or what it means in terms of our services, in terms of potentially some of the latent demand issues, particularly from COVID, and how that's going to impact. Clearly, we know that the sector's pushing for a sustainable medium-term settlement. So again, there's going to be concerted lobbying and pushing central government to come up with a medium-term spending proposition for councils rather than a succession of one-year spending or funding allocations, because otherwise we're just going to be limping from 1 year to the next, and it makes planning especially difficult. But I wouldn't underestimate the national challenge facing government in terms of, you know, what does it mean in terms of fiscal measures going forward, and how are they going to collect the revenues going forward to sustain public services in and amongst a plethora of other demands. But clearly we need a sustainable long-term financial settlement. So I think autumn's going to be absolutely critical for the sector, and it'll be interesting to see what comes from that. And clearly the LGA and others, when they submitted their views for the March settlement, were putting a lot of markers really about getting some views on the longer term position. So I'll kind of leave it at that for now. So I appreciate I've talked for a bit and put a bit of detail and substance into the March settlement, but it's important because that obviously will impact in terms of our communities, residents, businesses, individuals, and council and partner services as well, and continue to do so.
Okay. Philip Challoner,
two questions. The first one is around that you've got the overspend on special needs in that area, which you've put into a negative reserve now. Is there some indication that it's difficult, I suppose, with all the other pressures on government, that this will be addressed over the next year or two? Because otherwise, it's going to be growing almost sort of like a snowball, isn't it? Really? That's that one. That's that question. So if you answer that, and then I can go back with the other one in a second, and I've rephrased my mind.
That's okay. No, it's a good question. Yeah, I mean, we've been highlighting across, for quite a while now at council level, the pressures on not just high needs but SEND, special educational needs and disabilities, that whole system pressure. Pretty much it's a local, I think it was the Children and Families Act came in 2014, and that pressure has risen, and it's not necessarily being matched by commensurate level of funding allocation, reflecting how those pressures have developed. So we've been reporting on that, and you're right. Yeah, the current indication is at year end we will have a negative reserve. We have got some demand reserve or demand-led reserves that we've set aside, which coincidentally or otherwise kind of match our current situation. But you're absolutely right. There are potential structural pressures going forward as well. So we will be having and continue to have those conversations with Department for Education, Ministry of Housing, Communities, Local Government, as will the broader sector as well, because it's not purely us. Increasingly, other councils are having similar pressures which are coming forward. Ours are probably significantly higher for a number of reasons. I think quite a lot of that is to do with some of the underfunding issues. And I'll go back to it because it's important to remember that when government reviewed its school funding allocations for 2018-19 as part of a national review, they'd highlighted that in terms of high needs funding through the dedicated schools grant, our base budget provision was around about £7 million per annum underfunded. And that's government acknowledging that. But because of the way that when they're redistributing a finite level of funds within the system, they put in protections and safeguards so that councils that might be losing some money, they don't lose it all in year one. And similarly, councils that are due to gain more don't necessarily get it all in year one. So we've been getting that extra funding in increments of 1 million. So I reckon to date that had we had the extra 7 million per annum that government calculated we were due, then we would probably be around about £15 million better off. So what is just under a 20 million forecast high needs negative reserve would have been nearer 4 or 5 million. So there's still a structural pressure there, but we are where we are, and we're going to work with government departments. It's worth noting as well that we've put a lot of investment in the last couple of budget rounds just into that area as well, because it goes way beyond just the funding. It's actually a whole system review and transformation of how, not just what we do around special educational needs and disabilities, but how we do it. as well in terms of operational practice and putting, the child strength-based approach at the centre of that. Of that approach, and coincidentally not coincidentally, because there's been a lot of work going on in the background, there's some major reports that are now starting to come through. So on the Cabinet's agenda for 16th of March, there's shall we say an overview of that whole transformation agenda around SEN, and it's got in scope already bringing on board some external partners to support us with that transformation journey, and some specific measures around funding for schools in terms of them being able to self-sustain, issues around meeting SEN needs in their school environments, rather than not being able to manage that and effectively moving those children or supporting those children elsewhere through other environments. So those are two early measures, and there's going to be some further reports coming back, particularly around district sufficiency on special school places, where we've got a significant capital programme, and it's putting the meat on the bones and start to come back with the detail of what that's going to look like and shape over the next 3 or 4 years. So it's not just about the funding, but we are lobbying hard with government to recognise that. But it's also about a whole systems change as well as part of that journey. And that's one of our key transformation priorities as a council. So I appreciate that's quite a long answer. We don't know beyond 2021, 22, or possibly even 22, 23, because government did announce schools funding allocations up to 22, 23. And that had some extra national investment in to support high needs pressures, but those pressures will continue in future years. So we don't know what the government trajectory is beyond that. But I do know that the Department for Education, HM Treasury, schools and councils are looking at a whole raft of different measures. To some extent, the pressure, that negative reserve, has just been parked into the council's balance sheet. But clearly, while it's there, it's impacting on our overall financial sustainability going forward. So that's. I hope that gives you a flavour of. Well,
thank you for that one. I've got the other question.
The work that's going on.
But that's a very, very comprehensive answer, and thank you. Now, there's a lot of work going on in the background there, as you say, about transformation, which is very helpful. The other thing was really about public health. I think public health has become a big issue recently, but I was concerned pre-COVID about public health finances, because there was no guarantee of funding beyond this next year when we were meeting back in the last financial year. And so do you think they might have learnt some lessons from the COVID issue and perhaps maintain that funding for public health?
Good question. As of going to press, as it were, this morning, we haven't yet received what the public health grant allocations are from government for 21-22. So I think government will probably be short-term committed to underwriting the pre-existing levels of public health funding. As you know, through the austerity era, public health grant funding, when it transferred to councils, has been cut by government. There's no pussyfooting around that. That's what's happened. So councils, public health departments have had to manage within reduced means over a number of years. I mean, that's something for national policy, clearly, in terms of what future investment's going to go into that area, because it's absolutely critical. And it's and public health and preventive measures and tackling a whole raft of health inequality issues, again, predates COVID. The Marmite Review and others have extensively reported on that. What COVID's done is effectively exacerbated and brought into stark relief those pre-existing systemic and structural inequalities, and that goes way beyond just public health, as I'm sure you appreciate, Philip, having worked in that. And that's an area that, from your professional viewpoint, your chapter and verse on it. there are some clear systemic issues that need to be addressed as a fundamental matter of national public policy, addressed at a national, regional and local level, and we'll wait and see how that agenda develops. But that's just my opinion as an officer.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. Yeah, I just thought I'd raise it, didn't we?
Thanks for that, Eamon. Very comprehensive answer. Will Simpson.
Cheers, Chair. My question's going to be really boring now compared to that interesting thought I had with Eamon and Philip. It was just on the in part 2 of the report where you've put, and it's the third section of that 2.1 III. You've put down other net spend pressures identified at 1.9 million. So I'm assuming those are not COVID related and not things that we could have reasonably have put down to try and get back from government as a COVID pressure. So I was just wondering what that 1.9 million, what those pressures were.
Yeah, I think it's worth saying we've done our best as an authority and as officers to try and differentiate between COVID specific and non-COVID specific, and any officer who's been heavily involved in that would say there are some grey areas in that. As you know, it's not always as pure as you can, but we've done our best with it. Probably the single biggest issue is the fact that we budgeted for a 2% pay award in 2021, and as we know, the national pay award was agreed at 2.7%. So that created a 1.4 million pressure on the other. So that's kind of washed through, but I'm still absolutely confident come year end we'll manage to get that back into a balanced budget position overall. But that's probably the single biggest factor, and then the other there's amalgam of little, probably odds and sods, as I'd refer to them, that are spread across a number of service areas. Some bigger than others that are kind of netted off, but there's still, as you well appreciate from previous years, there's still plenty of water under the bridge even at this time of the year, as we get into the final month, where things will sort of pop out, but I'm absolutely confident we'll reach a balanced budget position by year end.
Okay, thanks for that. And Graham Turner?
I did, but Eamon answered what I was going to point out about the structural underfunding of SEND, and the fact that despite the government admitting that we were 7 million a year light on funding that they refused to give us, and just to follow on from it, we're not unique. This is happening across the country. I think virtually every council is carrying a structural deficit for the gross underfunding of SEND. But yeah, it is an issue, but they're going to have to address it at some point.
More broadly, is I know there are certainly grey areas regarding what is COVID and what isn't COVID, but is there a sort of standard view across local government about whether we have received all the money that we should have received, because government says it's going to ensure that none of us are out of pocket as a result of COVID? Have we got is there a standard methodology for working out how much money government owes us?
There are many methodologies at the moment.
I thought that would be the answer.
Depends what you want the answer to be, which methodology you want to choose. But putting that aside, right since the start of this, for pretty much the last 10 months, all councils have been reporting monthly into Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government on the COVID pressures, and that includes additional spend, it includes income loss, service income loss, council tax, business rates, and latterly picking up on other areas as well in terms of education sector impacts on schools, and if you've got a housing revenue account, impacts there as well. So that information is being collated monthly and played out with MHCLG, and that's been really, really useful, I think, for MHCLG in terms of its own lobbying with other government departments and with HM Treasury. As you appreciate, at the national level, Ministers also have to fight for the corner of their respective departments in getting whatever funding's on the table, and that's going to continue, and that's going to continue that process through into 21-22. So what happens with all that information that's collated is then that's played back and published at a national level, and then that's picked up by local government association, special interest groups of metropolitan authorities that we're members of. And there's various benchmarking going on at a Yorkshire and Yorkshire Humberside level. But I think where we're at the moment, depending on what your definition of is what the gap is, I think the LGA are saying there is still a bit of a funding gap. I think at the start of this, it was multi-billions. Then over time, it's whittled down. But there are still a number of known unknowns because some of those funding gaps are rolling forward into 21-22. And some of the additional funding that's been given to government through the financial settlement for 21-22, which is one-off and specific to fund continuing COVID pressures, may or may not be enough. So I'm not going to give you a definitive answer on that, but LGA and Sigoma of others would be arguing that there's still some element of gap that needs to be addressed because some of the compensation measures we weren't given 100%. Like with the income compensation scheme, where there's service income impacted loss from COVID, it's 75%. And some of the council tax and business rates losses that are rolling forward into next year, government's got some compensation against those, but again, it's not 100%. So it's still a bit fluid. Ask me in 12 months' time, I might be able to give you a definitive answer then.
Just to add to that, one of the problems, as Eamon's rightly pointed out, is because every local authority raises some money from a different ways, has different income streams. It's really difficult. But he's right, Sigoma still think there's a gap. I suppose the question is, if you ask any finance officer and any corporate member, cabinet member, if there's ever enough money, no. Nobody's ever going to say we've got everything we want, are we? Because there's always something we could have spent on. But as Em's right, I think we need another 12 months at least to work it out. But because there was that promise that do whatever it takes, and what we thought was do what it takes didn't chime necessarily further down the line. What the government thought do everything takes means, like, we give free car parking, which we thought was the right thing to do. People were advised not to use public transport. It was cut back, and we wanted people in town centre spending some money, and then we only got 75% back, which, whilst is significant in Kirklees, it'll be a bit more in Westminster.
I thought when I asked the question about the money, that it wouldn't be a case of we just send government an invoice at the end of every month. I got a funny idea that wasn't going to be the answer. So it is always interesting to look around the intricacies of these things and know that it's never a simple explanation.
Can I just add to that? Can I just say the other real, I think the real problem is not what's happened, because we've got through that all being well. It's the future. Because there's still going to be COVID costs coming through, still going to be COVID pressures coming through. How much of that is going to be funded? And it's fine, we can roll some of this debt forward, but still rolling debt forward is still debt. So it's the next 12 months, or possibly the year after, when the if you like, the chickies might come home to roost, and that's when I think we'll need support. And we don't know what the government thinking is, because I said they only give us a 1-year settlement, so there's not a lot of strategic thinking going on. But this year and next year, I think, will be real challenges for local government, not just us, absolutely everybody.
Okay. Right, Eamon, go for it.
No, it's okay. I was just going to concur with what Councillor Turner said, really, about there's potentially a whole raft of latent demand issues that are going to wash through that we haven't even started to address yet, that are going to put significant demands potentially on council departments and partners. I think, and as well as on communities, individuals and residents and businesses. But I think the other point is just the interesting dynamic of dealing with different government departments. And you know this already, no two Whitehall departments are the same in terms of approach on some of these issues. So I think MHCLG have been very flexible and very supportive of the sector. I wouldn't say that that's necessarily been the case elsewhere, or other government departments have been a lot slower in being able to respond. Now, that might be due to capacity, culture, or just the way that they do things. But it's been noticeable, the different approaches from different government departments to some of the funding issues, even on basic issues of process. But that's just something we live and learn and manage and deal with.
Sure. Okay. Right. Nothing more on this, but thank you, Eamon. Much appreciated. Always good to know where we're at with the money, and we'll take that. I think is the end of the meeting, isn't it? So we are meeting again as a panel very shortly for an informal session to look at the forward work plan and look at the work going forward. And Jenny Bryce is typing.
Yes, I was just letting IT know that it's the end of the formal meeting, so they can close the stream.